All right, first of all, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. I've said it in many different venues, but I think election integrity is the most important issue in this upcoming election. I think there's a lot of momentum behind the work that President Trump has done on our behalf. But as the old axiom goes, it's not the people who vote that counts, it's the people who count the votes that counts. And we're right in the middle of that issue here in the state of Michigan. So thank you, MCU. Thank you, Linda, for pulling this together. Thank you, Chris, for all the fun technology challenges associated with pulling this together. As the one who's usually the techie having to worry about all this, I really appreciate all your efforts, Chris. So thank you. And also, Eric, I want to thank you and the folks out at Judicial Watch for all your efforts in protecting the integrity of the vote. A lot of the stuff that we have learned around how to protect our elections has come from data provided from the folks out at Judicial Watch. My wife and I were blessed to have a long evening with Chris Farrell from Judicial Watch a while back, and I'll tell you, the guys at the head of the helm out at Judicial Watch are some of the sharpest tools in the shed. They get it. If you remember all the dangling chads that happened in the 2000 election, if I remember correctly, the folks who actually challenged those votes and actually took that case up to the Supreme Court, those were the folks out at Judicial Watch. It is a very good organization. They've got a very good radar to figure out what's really important, what's not important. So I encourage you to support them. And here locally in Michigan, I would submit that one of the best folks safeguarding our elections right now and very active in that realm. You're going to hear from her a little bit later. That is Marion Sheridan. So Marion, I know you're going to probably share your contact information later, but please be sure to share that in the chat area because she knows how to gather critical resources and apply them in the right manner, in a productive manner, protect our elections, and I encourage you to support her in her efforts. So without further ado, many of you may recall my service in the Michigan Senate and my campaign for governor. Coming out of those endeavors, I went off to launch with some other folks the idea of a grassroots alliance because it became painfully aware to me, especially after my governor run, that funding is a key element of any campaign, whether it's policy advocacy or whether or not it's actually running for office. Funding is extremely important. And that's what we pull together is a way to, we don't have access to all the big daddy warbucks out there when it comes to campaigns, but if we have people contributing 10 bucks, 20 bucks a month towards the restoration of the voice of the grassroots, it can be a powerful mechanism. So that's what the Rocket Fuel Fund is all about. So let's talk about Michigan election integrity. And I'm going to flash back to 2016. And Jay, if you can go to the next slide. Chris, if you can go to the next slide. Just a little bit of flashback. A lot of you guys remember that 2016 election. One of the reasons I brought up Marion because she was instrumental in getting resources out to support the recount efforts. I was in the legislature at the time. I was serving on the Senate Elections and Government Reform Committee. So this was something very important to me. I had been doing some analyses of what our vote processes were, as being a member of that committee, and I had a lot of concerns, and a lot of those concerns, unfortunately, were brought forward in the results and aftermath of that 2016 election. Many of you guys recall that there was a recount called as a result of that by, what's her name? Jill Stein, I think it was. Coming out of that, during that recount, a lot of strange things were happening here in the state of Michigan. One of my in-district manager, Penny Kreider, was out at a precinct out in Detroit where they had 306 votes tallied in the poll book, but when you actually looked inside the voting machine, there were only 50 ballots. Now, there's a lot of possible explanations for that, but one of them is they found a ballot that had all the votes just the way they wanted them, and they kept cycling it through the voting machine until they tabulated the voting results that they wanted. So that's a bit of a concern. So coming out of that, I put together a letter to the Attorney General and also the Secretary of State in Michigan asking for an investigation into voter fraud. And the Attorney General did not take action upon that, but the Secretary of State did, and they identified 31 counts of voter fraud. Now, they couldn't go in and investigate exactly what happened in the precincts, what they did is a data mining search, if you will, where they tried to reconcile records on behind the scenes, and they identified 31 counts of voter fraud. They're also, along with that investigation, they requested data from 33 municipalities who did not provide data to the Secretary of State in support of it. So what are the odds that the good folks provided the data and the bad folks didn't? In response to the Secretary of State's conclusions, the Attorney General did do an investigation, and they found that 0 out of the 31 cases of voter fraud identified by the Secretary of State had prosecution merit. In other words, nobody was held accountable for the fact that they voted twice, at least twice. And unfortunately, there was no follow-up requiring the data from the other 33 municipalities. Sadly, we had Republican control of the Michigan Senate and the Michigan Government Reforms and Election Committee. And despite being on the committee, I made multiple appeals for us to have a hearing ourselves to investigate where are the vulnerabilities in our current election system, what vulnerabilities are out there, how can we plug them. And I can tell you, for doing this for a long, long time, we had no hearing, unfortunately, which is a rather sad state of affairs, frankly. So let's go down to the next slide, please. So Republicans did nothing regarding protecting our election integrity. Democrats were very active at usurping and messing with our voter integrity. Many of you may recall the ballot proposals that happened in 2016. They had one euphemistically called Voters Not Politicians. And what they proposed was a redistricting scheme that they said they were returning power back to the people so that they could have their voices heard. And instead, if you actually read what the proposal actually did, what they did is take redistricting authority away from 149 elected officials and replace it with just one, the Secretary of State. And of course, they made sure that they had a very good candidate from a Democratic perspective in as their Secretary of State nominee, and that was Jocelyn Benson, and they were successful in that pursuit. Another key thing that they did is ballot proposal 3. And essentially, that opened the door to no reason absentee voting and same-day voter registration. And what this does is essentially enables a targeted get-out-the-vote campaign on steroids. You guys remember what happened in the Iowa caucus just most recently, right? You saw that they had this nice little voter app that they had deployed out in Iowa to go off and ostensibly to tally the votes. Well, I have a very dear friend of mine by the name of Nick Ruiz, and he went off, and it turns out that the application that they use to monitor all these votes and track these votes is something that's publicly sourced. It's an open source application you can download and test it yourself. Well, he did that. He's a real good computer geek. And by the way, if you want to hear more about Nick and what his analysis of election integrity from a data wizard perspective, I encourage you to go to Operation Freedom. He's got a great video of him with Bill Binney. If you don't know who he is, you're not paying attention to what's going on at the NSA. He is a whistleblower talking about corruption on the use of data, the National Security Agency to spy on American citizens. Bill Binney and also Kirk Wiebe. He's got a great interview on Operation Freedom. You'll get an idea of just how talented this guy is from that video. So that's, once again, that's Operation Freedom, and Dr. Dave Janda runs that, and great information on it. But what he found was that application for the Iowa caucus app was not really focused on tallying the votes, which it did a horrible job of, right? We all remember the games that all the stories that came out as a result of those Iowa caucus. They couldn't figure it out for, I think it was 3 days before they figured out who actually won that. Well, the reason for that is because the application was not intended, its primary focus was not to tally the votes. It was about data mining. And what happened was that application went off and dug through and identified all the contacts on the people's phones who installed it in order for them to vote. They mined for all that data, dumped it out to a server, and this gets to the heart of what the Democrats are working to, and it ties into why ballot proposal 2 and ballot proposal 3 were so important. With all their national money, a lot of the money for those campaigns came from outside of the state. what they were doing was using that data to enable things that have happened in this last election are going to be happening in this election. And that is, excuse me, I've got a nice little, all right, is that what they're trying to do, or what they're doing now in this election, is that they've got all this data now that they can reconcile. They can identify who are Democratic propensity voters, and they are sending them on these no reason applications to go off and vote, so that they can have a get out the vote campaign that encourages people. Or what they do is they'll mail out a application to register for absentee voting. They'll have it all filled out. The person only has to go off and fill in their signature and mail it back in. Now, those are propensity Democratic voters. And so you can understand that they're trying to tilt the wheel so that the majority of folks who are voting, particularly absentee, are going to have a Democratic slant to them. Next slide, please. All right, so there's some basic election integrity objectives. So if we actually look at how we're going to go off and solve this issue, I've gotten Democrats to agree with all the principles in this election integrity objective breakout here. Basic things on what happens before one casts a vote, after one casts a vote, and how to go off and enforce it. I got Senator Coleman Young to agree on all these different points. We're going to work forward on this, and then we got into this little thing called a governor race, and all of a sudden things went quiet. But there is general agreement in principle on all these objectives across the board. Next slide. So how do you go off and address those? Well, many of you guys know my background's in aerospace engineering. I love process flow diagrams. And what I did is I took our Michigan election manual and sat down with the folks out of Secretary of State and other experts throughout the state and mapped out all the key election processes. And it's complicated across the board. You've got voter registration, which is a key area that has to get examined, because if they whoever gets on the voter roll is actually determined by these voter registration process. And you saw why the Democrats emphasize that in their ballot proposals. The other key thing is election day preparation. Simple things like when they quote unquote zero out the voting machines so that they're not preloaded with the votes with the results that you want. That's important. You've got poll voting, you've got absentee voting. Those are slightly different processes that you've got to go off and manage effectively, make sure you protect that integrity. You got the whole idea of precinct closure. So it's one thing, everybody goes out and does the votes, but ultimately, to Stalin's point, who said that little axiom here, it's about who actually count the votes that matters, and that happens when you close the precinct. And that also involves precinct reconciliation, and then the old process of election certification, which gets very interesting in my home county, Wayne County, because they're always waiting for the votes to be tallied from the folks in Detroit. And then, of course, when Jill Stein and others go off and decide they want to do a recount, there's a whole set of processes around that need to be examined as well. Next slide. So when it all boils down to, when you look at all those different process flows, it became evident to me, who's done a lot of failure modes and effects analyses with complex systems for things like, for programs like Space Station, that there are three key checkpoints. Number one, you have to maintain the integrity of this qualified voter file. That is the list of registered voters in the state of Michigan. Number two, you need to maintain the integrity of the poll books, which means that you need to be able to confirm that the person who actually comes to you saying that they're one of the registered voter on the qualified voter file, that they are the person that is actually intending to vote at either via their absentee ballot or in person at the poll. And then last, you got to go off and protect the integrity of the actual ballots. Many of you guys may not realize this or not, but as soon as a person votes, any connection between who voted and what that vote was is torn off at the top. And so it's too late to go off and make those connections after that ballot has already been inserted in the machine. So maintaining integrity of the ballots is very important. Next slide. So what can we do? I would propose the following key election integrity measures need to be pursued by our folks out in the legislature. Number one, as Eric was talking about, make sure you're in compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. That'll help us clean up the qualified voter file. The next is implement voter ID. You got to be able to confirm that the person voting is actually the one who is listed on that qualified voter file. And then Next is something that is extremely important, especially because they pass this same-day voter registration, is that make sure that provisional ballots are not tallied until you confirm that that person has only voted once. You want to prevent that situation where Democrats are famous for, where they will bus people around from precinct to precinct to precinct and get them to vote as many times as they'd like to vote. And you got to go off and verify that they are who they say they are and that they are only voted once. The next is I would propose 24/7 ballot monitoring. That means you got to monitor where those ballots are and the control points around where those ballots are stored, whether it's absentee ballots or poll ballots. Make sure that you've got constant surveillance of where those ballots are and who's touching them and what are they doing with them. And as soon as you see something funky going on, that's when you send in a quick response team, complete with folks with badges on them to enforce the law. So that's some key data points that I've got from examining election integrity. The folks out of True the Vote with Catherine Engelbrecht are another great resource with this, but I encourage you to check that out. And if you want to find out more why some of these measures are not taken, if you go to the next slide, Chris, I try to talk about it in my book, Wrestling Gators, and it talks about how government really works. And if you wonder why they say one thing on the campaign trail and do something completely different once they get elected into office, hopefully this book will provide you with some insights. It's available up on Amazon, and I was honored to be recognized as one of the best political books of all time. And I really put a lot of heart and soul in that. I hope it's something that if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, you get an opportunity to do so. So Michigan Grassroots Alliance, go to rocketfuelfund.org. And also, please stay tuned for Marion Sheridan's presentation on Election Day operations. That will be critical this year. Thank you very much, Chris.
Pat, thank